Distro on the horizon. Honeybun. With every passing day, the world crumbled apart further until the modernity of the former status quo was unrecognizable. The reset was precisely so, a complete erasure of the world's hierarchy, leaving everyone on a level playing field. A catastrophe indiscriminate of one's social or financial standing. The rules everyone was indoctrinated to follow aimlessly without question was revealed to be nothing more than a synthetic restructure of the natural order, granting an unfair advantage to the very few deserving, while the many unworthy suffered. Now, we all endured equally, with the only edge of dominance being natural selection. Having Big Dave by our side again did wonders for morale. With his freedom, we finally wiped away any lingering guilt that remained from the bank job, although the loss of Mason would leave remorse forever etched on our conscience. For what it was worth, the group was whole again, allowing us to continue hitting the bucket list together. Rather than go after the big-ticket items, we chose to settle down for the winter. Thanks to the New World Order, we had nothing but time and opportunity on our side. We reclaimed my family home with zero resistance or difficulty. The entire neighborhood had become deserted. The small town of Harris, Virginia, was never known as being crowded in the first place, although the nearby highway did allow for enough traffic to keep the town afloat with income from travelers. Most notable was the many warehouses and factories that produced paper products that were the true lifeblood of the town. Over the course of the winter season, we kept to ourselves while the few remaining people still living in Harris did so as well. Tex and Garrett would hunt for fresh meat, while Forrester kept a pile of firewood large enough for us to remain comfortable. Do-Yun and Big Dave would occasionally explore the town for necessities. Oftentimes, they would come across locals looking to trade. The pair were intimidating enough for most people to keep their distance, but the desperation of possible starvation made more and more people take the risk. After living here for a month, we grew tired of our isolation from the townsfolk and opted to engage as active parts of the community. By spring, we were able to band with the rest of the town and become somewhat self-sustainable. Forrester even hit it off with a redhead, and in the face of our apocalyptic reality, found love. The choice of coming back to Harris was a hard one for me personally. It was a small, boring town in the middle of nowhere with not much to do. I joined the military right after graduating high school with the intention of never coming back. During my first year enlisted, my family lost the house, and with it all my ties to the town. There was no reason for me to go back once my parents moved to Richmond. Late one night while we were deployed to Kunduz, I was awoken with a grim message from the American Red Cross Association. My parents had died in a car accident. I needed to go home to attend their funeral, but in my way was my chain of command. Seeing as how I was the only person with the training and qualifications to repair the battalion's drones, I was forced to remain in country until one of the civilian contractors could be transferred over from Bagram Airfield. My commander and first sergeant refused to allow me to take emergency leave until I had a replacement. That's the moment I decided I was never going to re-enlist. After all the company formations preaching about the importance of family, they showed me that they didn't give a shit about anything outside the mission at hand. By the time I was finally granted leave, my parents had already been buried. I spent my time back in the States talking to their graves about how sorry I was to miss their funerals and thanked them for everything they had done for me. It was the most depressing vacation I had ever been on. Once I arrived back in Afghanistan, apparently all shit had hit the fan during my absence, with several of my closest friends being sent home. Needless to say, that entire shitstorm resulted in many of us losing touch, but Mason wrote me countless letters while he was awaiting his discharge from service. Oh, Mason. I don't even have the words to describe just how much he meant to me. He was one of the only things that kept me grounded to reality when I felt so alone. I just wish I could have made him feel the same. Simply put, reclaiming my family's house was a nice enough idea, but having these people along with me made it feel like a home. I had a family, and wherever we went was home enough for me, and that would never have been possible without Mason's desire to rob a bank. Every good story is deserving of a tragic ending. At least that's what my pessimistic side has been conditioned to believe. Our sojourn away from the chaotic world couldn't last. Sooner or later, the new world born from the reset would creep its way into our quiet small town just off Route 60. Ever since the aftermath of the fundraiser, we stayed away from major cities, since all the information we gathered pointed to them being absolute garbage fires born of civil unrest. We kept to ourselves, far away from the rapid decline of society. With the exception of Forrester, all of us were on the north end of town, scavenging the paper mill for fuel on that cool mid-March morning. As Garrett started using his lips in a cut-off portion of garden hose to siphon what diesel remained in a delivery truck, we heard the distinct rumble of vehicles echoing from the town's main thoroughfare. There had not been any visitors from out of town since our arrival the previous December, not to mention the fact that gas had become a hot commodity. Who in the world would waste fuel coming so far out to a place like Harris? Garrett and Big Dave never left the house without their rifles, so thankfully the two of them were always prepared for conflict. Tex, on the other hand, had become overly relaxed with our living situation and only bothered to carry a weapon if he saw deer in the area. I never expected our resident doomsday prepper to become so lackadaisical. Guns weren't exactly my style, although I did have a spare drone sitting in the back of the van. Do-Yun drove us as I set things up so we would have an aerial perception of our unwelcome guests. Once my little metal bird was ready to go, I tossed it out the window of the moving van, the quad-style propellers whirled to life, and the drone flew straight for downtown. There wasn't a single car, just a couple of them. There was an entire convoy of trucks rolling down Main Street. There were 2 flatbed semi-trucks, 3 SUVs, a fuel tanker, and a single up-armored military-grade MRAP in the middle of the convoy. Whoever these people were, they came fully prepared to lay waste to the entire town. The only discernible logo I could see was a hastily sprayed Distro 6 on several of the trucks. That raised more questions than answers. If anything was obvious, is that we needed a plan. Fast. Do-Yun dropped off Garrett and Big Dave at the back of the town's chapel. The church had a bell tower with a vantage point that pointed straight down the main road. Garrett, being our most proficient marksman, took to the tower while Big Dave remained at the ground floor to assist with suppressive fire. My house was at the opposite end of the town, and there was no way to get there without directly going through the convoy. So we had to find another place to get weapons. Tex informed us that he knew how to make a quick, although low-grade pipe bomb if we could get him to the abandoned hardware store. Do-Yun managed to take a few side streets to get to the back of the hardware stores to avoid the approaching trucks that would pass by the front. While Tex snuck inside to crash and desperately needed aid, I kept my attention to the perspective of the drone so Do-Yun and I could radio updates to the rest of the team. The convoy halted at the town's primary intersection, and several men geared head-to-toe in tactical gear carrying M4s started rushing out of the SUVs. To avoid them seeing or possibly hearing the drone, I made it land on the corner of a building's roof, positioned precisely to allow free movement of its camera. The men started sweeping through the buildings, forcing anyone they found to the streets at gunpoint. Unfortunately, caught in the middle of the commotion, Forrester, along with his red-headed lady love, were pushed out of the apartment they called home. By the time the searches were complete, nearly half the town was knelt on their knees with their hands behind their heads. At that point, slithering out of the MRAP was a middle-aged man in a navy-colored suit. It became very apparent that he was an authority figure. The man paced around the lines of people on their knees, occasionally pointing at a person just for them to be dragged away, kicking and screaming into the back of the MRAP. There were 2 things these people had in common. They were all female, and they all had red to reddish-colored hair. We all knew the moment Forrester's girl was called that he would fight tooth and nail to stop the strangers from taking her away. We knew we were outnumbered, outgunned, and the odds were incredibly stacked against us. The risk of exposing our positions would only spell disaster for everyone held hostage. Tex reported in letting us know he was finished making the pipe bombs and on his way towards the back of the convoy, right where the tanker was located. If we learned anything from our time overseas, it was that fuelers maintained the riskiest position in a convoy, as they were essentially motorized massive bombs capable of causing immense damage. Of all the targets in the world, Tex knew precisely which to hit. When Forrester's girlfriend was motioned to take her seat in the convoy, she began struggling in protest. All the same, 2 men grabbed her by the arms and legs, while the others began beating Forrester. With a quick waving brush of his hand, the old guy wearing the suit turned away from the crowd and headed back to the MRAP. They say the shot heard around the world was the one that kicked off the American Revolution. The shot that will echo in my thoughts for the rest of my days is the one that killed dear Trinidad. One moment, he was pleading for the safe release of the love of his life. The next, he lay motionless on blood-damp pavement with a bullet hole in his forehead. Immediately after Forrester was killed, Garrett and Big Dave started unleashing a barrage of bullets towards the convoy. To assist them, I fired up the drone, having it fly low to the ground to distract the men firing back at the church. The ensuing crossfire ended with many of the town's people getting hit and falling bloody and lifeless to the ground, much like Forrester. It didn't take long for my drone to get swatted down as well, leaving the only visual massacre of the town square a radio call away to the boys holding firm at the church. Tex didn't waste his chance to toss the pipe bombs at the trucks. A couple seconds after he tossed them, rang a loud explosion that shook buildings, shattered windows, and expelled an intense wave of heat that enveloped all of Main Street. Hitting the tanker was a bold move, yet necessary. We witnessed losing Forrester to these bastards. so why not take as many of them out as we could? When the dust settled after the blast, we saw a couple of SUVs and the MRAP hightail it out of town. All of us rushed to meet each other in the town center so Do-Yun could assess everyone's physical condition. Big Dave's neck was grazed by a stray bullet. Garrett had shards of glass in his side, and worst of all, Tex's right eardrum ruptured with a trickle of blood dripping out of his ear canal. For what it was worth, we still had our lives, although that meant less and less with every departing member of our family. Big Dave found a survivor he dragged out of one of the busted trucks. All the hell unleashed, and the last person standing was one of the kidnappers that tagged along on the road trip to the wrong town. Before the guy even had a chance to beg for his life, Big Dave started laying into him, one fist after another until his face was unrecognizable. Do-Yun allowed him to pummel the guy for a moment, but stopped before Big Dave outright killed him. We would squeeze every ounce of intel out of the guy before we would grant him the serenity of death. According to the trucker at our mercy, he was part of what was called a Distro team that was sent to scavenge supplies and bring them back to Charlotte, North Carolina, where they were based. As for abducting all the redheaded women, all he knew was that people higher up than he was looking for someone that fit that description. Turns out, the older man in the suit was a senator, at least before the reset. Now, he was one of the men in charge of keeping Charlotte afloat, and not turning to ruin like so many of the other major cities. This guy, his only task was to drive a semi-truck to assist with stealing supplies and deliver them back home. To us, he was just as guilty as the man that shot Forrester. Through gurgled breaths, the guy begged for his life. Garrett simply shook his head, spit on the man, and told him that they killed our friend, and for that he gets to suffer. Garrett laid 2 shots into the guy's belly, making him convulse in pain. As we left him to bleed out, we walked over to Forrester's remains and collectively carried him away from the town center. We buried Forrester in my backyard next to where I buried my puppy that died when I was a kid. Forrester never told us what he wanted us to do with him if he ever died. It was a conversation none of us had. Well, except for Mason. He always told me that since he was so split on being buried or cremated, that he just wanted to do both, and that he would let me choose which half of him was buried and which to put in the ground. Needless to say, I didn't have any input for his last rites. We spent one final night in my family home, taking a moment to grieve for the loss of our friend. We stayed up most of the night telling stories about Forrester, how we met him, the fun times we had together, and just how much he meant to us. Collectively, we all agreed that come sunrise, we would set our sights on Distro Team 6. For the time being, the list could wait. Vengeance was the only endeavor we cared about, and we made it our mission to give each one of those pricks the justice they had coming. All that remained was something that we dreaded since Mason's death. We sat before the crackling fireplace and started reading Forrester's death letter. Death Letter Forrester. To this wonderful band of misfits. Is any of this really necessary? Mason is acting like as if tomorrow is going to be our last day on Earth. Newsflash, brother. The world isn't going to end anytime soon. We've put together a good plan of attack for the bank. I'm confident that it will go off without a hitch, especially with all the help from the girls. They really thought of everything. If it was down to just the 5 of us guys, we would have just brought ski masks and tried robbing it during our lunch rush. That would have been more exciting than going under the cover at night. I doubt that anyone will ever read these. That's the idea, right? To write whatever we want, knowing that no one will ever read it, and in the highly unlikely chance that we do indeed die, only the surviving members of our group will see it, which makes these letters, once opened, the final words we have to share with the world. So, basically, these are suicide notes. Or whatever the opposite of a suicide note would be. Fuck. Leave it to Mason to make us do this twisted shit. The 2 of us wagered our share of the loot gained from the heist. First to die gets the share of the other. Yeah, I know Mason was on the metaphorical edge of the rooftop, but you can't expect me to pass up a bet with the odds so highly stacked in my favor. I'm sure that even if he was in a sound mental space, I'd outlive damn near all of you, with the only exception of being Tex. I've seen the way you drink, the way you eat, and lost count of the number of cans of chewing tobacco you go through in a single day. You might be the oldest in the group, but if you hadn't croaked by now, I'm sure you'll never die. I guess the only thing I can say is thank you. To those still left standing, I appreciate the time we spent together. From your constant complaints of the food quality while we were deployed, to the Saturday mornings thanking me for breakfast after a long night of drinking in Watertown. I really do appreciate every moment spent with you. I always found it difficult to tell people how I feel about them. Words are ultimately meaningless. Only actions can prove what your words claim. It was an honor for me to share my culinary passion with you. Truth be told, I came to this country with nothing. I left Trinidad disowned by my family without a penny to my name. I figured enlistment was the best way for me to gain my citizenship. Being treated like shit on a daily basis was far better than being homeless. I never expected to form the bonds I did. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Sincerely, Richard T. Forrester.